Welcome back, everybody, to another deep dive with us.
Glad to be here.
So this time you guys sent in quite the collection of stuff on Ethiopia.
It's a lot.
Yeah, financial reports, legal cases, some on-the-ground stuff, even like parents talking about school fees. It's kind of all over the place.
Yeah, it really is, and that's part of what made it so interesting to look at.
Right. It's like, at first glance, Ethiopia is doing great.
Right. You see the big numbers, growth, this and that.
But then you see, like, water shortages in Addis.
Yeah.
And you hear about fuel getting cut off.
And you start to think,
Yeah, what's really going on here?
Exactly. So we really wanted to take a look at what's beneath the surface.
Yeah, and maybe make some sense of it all.
Right.
So let's get into it. One of the first things that stood out to me was this whole thing with Abay Bank.
Okay.
So their reports look amazing. Deposits are up. Assets are growing.
Yeah, classic success story.
Totally. But then you look at their profits, and they're actually shrinking.
Yeah, see, that's where it gets interesting.
Right, because how can you have all this growth but not be making more money?
Well, that's the question, isn't it? And it's because there are other factors at play.
Like what?
Well, for one thing, their interest expenses are way up.
Okay, so that means they have to pay more to people who are keeping their money with them.
Exactly, and that cuts into how much profit they end up with.
Even though they have more customers giving them money.
More money, but more costs, too. It's a balancing act.
So it's not as simple as just looking at how much money they're bringing in.
No, not at all. You got to look at the whole picture, and another part of that picture for Abay is that they're spending a lot.
Oh, really? On what?
Well, they're investing heavily in technology, new branches, expanding their reach.
So they're going for big growth, but it's risky, right?
It is. Some shareholders are even saying it doesn't add up.
They think Abay's overreaching.
It's possible they might be pushing too hard too fast, but it's a trend we're seeing across Ethiopia's financial sector.
These private banks trying to compete.
Yeah, vying for market share. But there's still a lot of regulations on lending, and that could hold them back.
So even if their plans are good, the system might not let them succeed.
Exactly. It's a complex landscape.
And speaking of complex landscapes, we have to talk about Addis Ababa.
Oh, yeah.
The city's booming new buildings everywhere.
But they can't get enough water.
It's a crazy contrast. They're producing like 630,000 cubic meters of water a day.
Which sounds like a lot.
Right, but they need over 1 million.
Yeah, so people are facing rationing. Prices for water are going through the roof.
And it's not just an inconvenience, it's a health risk.
Absolutely, and if it keeps up, it could seriously damage the city's economy and reputation.
So are they doing anything to fix it?
They are. They're trying to expand dams, dig more wells, replace old pipes.
But is that enough?
It might help in the short term, but it's not a long-term solution.
What they really need are more efficient ways to manage the water they have.
Right, and maybe look into new technologies to increase supply.
It makes you wonder if they're struggling with something as basic as water. Yeah.
What does that say about all these big development projects they're taking on?
It's a valid question.
It's like, are they getting ahead of themselves?
Possibly. And we see this tension between ambition and reality in other areas, too.
Like what?
We'll take the situation in Harer, for example.
Oh, yeah? What happened there again?
The city administration just shut down 43 bank branches.
Just like that?
Yep, including big ones like CBE and Awash.
What was their reasoning?
Officially, they said it was for safety reasons, something about unfinished buildings.
But you don't buy that.
I'm skeptical, and it turns out there's a lot more to the story.
I bet there is. What's the real reason?
Well, according to the banks themselves, they were being pressured to pay 2 million birr per branch.
For what?
For these local development projects, corridor development, they called it.
So the city was basically holding these banks hostage.
In a way, yes. And the banks weren't having it.
What did they do?
They took legal action, and the National Bank had to step in to try and sort it all out.
Wow, so it's not just about money, it's about power, too. Right, and who gets to call the shots, and whose interests get prioritized?
And it makes you think, if this is happening in Harer,
yeah,
could it happen elsewhere, too?
It's definitely something to keep an eye on.
It's like this underlying tension that keeps popping up.
Absolutely, this push and pull between different groups and their goals.
And everyone's trying to figure out how to navigate it all.
Exactly, and that's what makes this whole deep dive so fascinating.
It's like peeling back the layers of the onion.
And the deeper you go, the more you realize how complex it all is.
All right, well, we're just getting started.
We've got a lot more to unpack.
So let's take a quick break, and then we'll dive back into the rest of these sources.
It's a tough situation all around, and it's not just the banks feeling the pressure.
Right. You're talking about the parents with kids in international schools.
Yeah, those tuition hikes are causing a lot of headaches.
Like that mom we heard from Aaron Asfaw. Her kids go to Flipper International School.
Right. Flipper.
And their tuition went up like 63,000 birr in one term.
Oof, that's rough.
It is, and it's because of this whole dollarization thing.
Yeah, when the birr's weak, people want to use dollars instead.
Makes sense, but it creates problems too.
Definitely, especially for schools. A lot of them set their fees in dollars.
And then when the exchange rate changes, bam.
Parents get hit with huge increases. It's not fair.
The Ministry of Education even warned schools about doing that.
But it doesn't seem to be stopping them.
So what can parents do?
It's tricky if they signed a contract that's in dollars, they're kind of stuck.
It's like they're trapped.
Yeah, and it really highlights the need for clearer rules and better oversight.
To protect people.
Exactly. These essential services like education shouldn't be subject to these kinds of currency games.
Speaking of things that are out of people's control, what about those fuel shortages?
Oh yeah, that's a whole other mess.
It's like 1 minute there's fuel, the next minute there's not.
And it's all tied to this big push for electric vehicles.
Right. The government wants to reduce fuel imports.
Which is a good goal, in theory.
But the reality is Ethiopia isn't ready for that.
Not yet. At least a lot of places still rely heavily on fuel.
And the infrastructure for electric cars is nowhere near where it needs to be.
We heard from Africa Oil. Remember they built all these new gas stations?
And then EPSE just cut off their supply.
Yeah, they were not happy about it.
I bet it's like the government's trying to skip a step.
A pretty big step, and it's hurting businesses and ordinary people in the process.
Like those folks in Benishangul Gumuz who can't even get fuel now.
It's causing real problems, and it's another example of good intentions gone wrong.
It seems like we keep coming back to this theme of ambition versus reality.
It's a recurring motif in this deep dive, for sure.
And then there's that whole legal fight between BGI and that woman Zudnish.
Oh yeah, that's a juicy one.
She says they cheated her out of her share of the company.
Millions of birr we're talking about.
27% she claims.
Which, if true, is a huge deal.
And BGI saying it's too late for her to make that claim.
Statute of limitations, they're arguing.
But her lawyers say that doesn't apply to property rights.
Which is what she's saying this is about.
So it all comes down to how the court interprets the case.
And then there's the whole political angle, too.
Right. She says she was pressured to sign away her shares back in 2001.
During that TPLF power struggle.
Like a tangled web.
Definitely. And we'll have to see how it all plays out in court.
From shady business dealings to government mismanagement, it's a lot to take in.
Speaking of which, those audit reports are pretty damning.
The Ethiopian Police University Phantom per deems unauthorized accounts.
And the immigration service collecting fees they weren't supposed to?
It's like nobody's watching the store.
And that's a huge problem because it erodes public trust.
And it makes people wonder where their money is going.
Exactly, and if it's not being used properly, that undermines the whole development agenda.
It's like shooting yourself in the foot.
Pretty much. And then on top of all that, you've got the Addis Ababa Revenue Bureau setting these salary standards.
Right, they say it's to prevent tax evasion.
But businesses are calling it a hidden minimum wage.
And they're worried it'll hurt the economy.
Especially sectors like textiles, they operate on thin margins.
So it's this balancing act again.
Trying to enforce the rules without stifling business.
It's a tough needle to thread.
And it shows how interconnected all these issues really are.
We've seen ambition, innovation, resilience.
But also shortages, inconsistencies, questions about transparency.
It's a mixed bag for sure.
And it's going to be interesting to see what happens next.
That's the big question, isn't it? What does all this mean for Ethiopia's future?
Will they be able to overcome these challenges?
Or will they be held back by them?
We'll have to wait and see, but one thing's for sure.
What's that?
It's a story worth paying attention to.
Thanks for joining us on this journey, folks.
Keep exploring, keep asking questions, keep digging deeper.
Until next time, take care.